Trump is declaring economic war on China, and the battleground is rare earth minerals. While most Americans have never heard of dysprosium or ytterbium, these obscure elements have just triggered the biggest market sell-off in 6 months and could reshape the global economy. The S&P 500 plunged nearly 3% on Friday, wiping out $2 trillion in market value in a single day.
Well, the S&P 500 turned lower in the final hour of the trade after, you guessed it, a flare-up in the trade war with China. President Trump threatening to stop trade in cooking oil with China in a Truth Social post, a retaliatory move after Beijing is continuing to refuse to buy American soybeans. Joining us now is Balance of Power co-host Joe Matthews. So, Joe, it feels like a little bit we're back in an environment where there's so much headline ping pong when it comes to what is the state of play with trade negotiations.
The catalyst? Trump's threat of massive tariff increases on Chinese products after Beijing tightened its grip on rare earth exports. But this isn't just another trade dispute. This is a fight for the future of technology itself. To understand why Trump is so furious, we need to grasp what's really at stake here. China doesn't just mine rare earth metals, it dominates them completely. We're talking about 70% of global production and over 90% of processing capabilities. These aren't optional ingredients in modern life. Every smartphone, electric vehicle, wind turbine, and missile guidance system depends on these materials. When China sneezes, the entire global supply chain catches pneumonia. On Thursday, Beijing dramatically escalated the situation by announcing new export controls on 5 additional rare earth metals, bringing the total under restriction to 12. The list now includes tungsten, tellurium, bismuth, indium, and molybdenum. These materials sound like science fiction, but are absolutely critical for defense systems, semiconductors, and clean energy technology. China is essentially weaponizing its monopoly over materials the entire world desperately needs.
Is China's latest moves on its rare earth supplies, adding some curbs to those exports. And it sounds like the bottom line is China has something every country needs, which is this supply of rare earths, and it's not afraid to weaponize it in the same way that the U.S. has weaponized its end marketplace.
Yeah, exactly. So the U.S. is arguing that this is going to hurt most major economies, not just the U.S. And China would say, well, you're kind of overinterpreting this. It's not going to be that bad. So there's a real disagreement about the impact that these rare earth restrictions that China announced last week would have. The bottom line, though, is they're still not seeing eye to eye on
The timing couldn't be more calculated. These restrictions came just weeks before a planned meeting between Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in South Korea. It's classic geopolitical chess. Xi is positioning his strongest pieces before sitting down at the negotiating table. But Trump isn't backing down. Instead, he's doubling down with threats of 100% tariffs on all Chinese imports, effective November 1st. His response on Truth Social was characteristically blunt. There is no way that China should be allowed to hold the world captive with its rare earths policy. He accused Beijing of becoming very hostile and suggested the restrictions were designed to control global supply chains. The market's reaction was swift and brutal. Tech stocks, which rely heavily on rare earth materials, led the sell-off. Chinese companies like Alibaba dropped 10%, while U.S. firms with significant China exposure, including Nvidia and Tesla, saw sharp declines. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. While most of the market was panicking, a small group of North American mining companies saw their stocks absolutely explode. Canadian rare earth developer Trilogy Metals rocketed nearly 140% after the U.S. government announced it was purchasing a 10% stake in the company. This wasn't just a market play, it was a strategic countermove in what's becoming an economic Cold War. The Trilogy deal reveals Trump's broader strategy. Rather than simply complaining about Chinese dominance, his administration is actively building alternative supply chains. The $35.6 million investment gives Washington not just a stake in the company, but also warrants to purchase an additional 7.5% if needed. More importantly, it unlocks access to Alaska's Ambler mining district, which contains vast deposits of copper, cobalt, germanium, gallium, and other critical minerals. The symbolism is powerful. Trump is literally reversing a Biden administration decision that blocked construction of the 211-mile Ambler Road project. Where the previous administration saw environmental concerns about caribou and fish populations, Trump sees national security imperatives. The road would connect the remote Ambler mining district to existing infrastructure, potentially creating one of North America's largest sources of critical minerals. But the Trilogy investment isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a broader pattern that reveals the scope of Trump's mineral security strategy. Just 2 weeks earlier, the Department of Energy cut a similar deal with Lithium Americas, another Canadian company, providing $435 million in federal funding for Nevada's Thacker Pass lithium project. The Department of Defense has also taken stakes in MP Materials, the only major U.S. rare earth producer, and is reportedly exploring investments in Critical Metals Corporation, which controls rare earth projects in Greenland. This aggressive government intervention in private markets represents a fundamental shift in American industrial policy. Traditionally, Washington has been reluctant to take direct equity stakes in mining companies. But the rare earth crisis has changed the calculus when a single country can essentially shut down global technology production and free market principles take a backseat to national security concerns. The ethical implications are staggering. Richard LeBlanc, a professor at York University, told Bloomberg that having a foreign government as an investor creates obvious conflicts of interest. To have an outside investor who can have regulatory approval, is that a conflict of interest? It absolutely is a conflict of interest, he said. But these concerns pale compared to the alternative, continued dependence on a strategic rival for materials essential to national defense. Trump has been particularly vocal about the importance of tariffs, describing them as essential to American national security and economic power.
You know, they've used tariffs on us, but we've never had anybody sitting in that chair that felt the need to do it. And they've allowed us to be $37 trillion in debt, et cetera, et cetera. Tariffs are a very important tool for our defense, for our national security. If we don't have tariffs, we're not going to have national security. As an example, if you look at Pakistan and Iran, I told them I was in the midst of negotiating a trade deal with Iran, and Pakistan was going to be in line. And because of tariffs, they all want to negotiate much differently. We're making a good deal. And then I heard that they're shooting at each other. And I said during one of my conversations, are you guys going to go to war? Two nuclear powers. We are thinking about, I said, here's the deal. You go to war, I'm going to put a 200% tariff. I'm going to stop you from doing any business in the United States. I said it to both of them. Within 24 hours, the war ended. That would have been a nuclear war. And again, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, who was here 2 weeks ago, said that man saved many millions of lives in front of a whole group of people because he thought it was going to be war. But when it came to war or having to pay massive tariffs, the tariffs overrode. That's why it's so important, not only the money, we're taking in trillions of dollars, not only the money, the power to keep peace, the power to be used for good.
In recent remarks, he's argued that without tariffs, America would be exposed as being nothing and would have no defense. He's even described an upcoming Supreme Court case about tariffs as one of the most important cases in the history of our country, warning that if they lose, America will become a weakened, troubled financial mess. He credits tariffs with preventing multiple wars and claims they've made America very rich, bringing in trillions of dollars. China's response has been predictably defiant. Beijing's Ministry of Commerce issued a statement saying China does not want a tariff war but is not afraid of one. Chinese officials defended their export controls as legitimate measures under international law while accusing the U.S. of double standards given America's own extensive export control lists. The back-and-forth rhetoric suggests both sides are preparing for a prolonged confrontation. The human cost of this economic warfare is already becoming apparent. Between 2020 and 2023, 70% of U.S. rare earth imports came from China. American manufacturers are now scrambling to find alternative sources, but building new supply chains takes years, not months. In the short term, this means higher costs for consumers and potential disruptions to everything from car production to renewable energy projects. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond bilateral trade. Europe, Japan, and other U.S. allies are watching nervously as the world's two largest economies engage in what amounts to economic mutual assured destruction. The European Chamber of Commerce in China has already reported backlogs in export license applications, adding further complexity to the global supply chains of rare earth elements. The diplomatic challenge facing the United States is particularly complex. After months of imposing tariffs on allies, Washington now finds itself trying to build a coalition against China. The question is whether America can have it both ways, punishing those same countries with tariffs while asking them to unite against China.
Looking to line up some support amongst our quote unquote allies. How tough is that going to be after the most recent 9 months where the president's rhetoric was not necessarily supportive of our so-called allies and tariffs not really supportive of our allies? How tough is that going to be?
Yeah, I mean, it's most of the world didn't retaliate against Trump's tariffs, and so you could say to some extent that was a successful deployment of tariffs from the Trump administration. But there's a lot of bad blood still. These tariffs are hurting European industries, and they're hurting Indian companies, and they're going to leave kind of some economic dislocations in places that are going to hurt these politicians that had to basically swallow these tariffs and not retaliate. So what the U.S. is going to try to do is try to unite the countries that it's pretty much tried to disconnect some of their and protect their own industries. And it's going to be a real test of whether can you have it both ways. Can you punish countries with tariffs and then ask them to be your friend in allying against China? There's a big question about.
The diplomatic damage from protectionist policies may have already undermined efforts to create a united front. And with only weeks remaining before the tariff ceasefire expires, time is running out to repair these relationships. What makes this crisis particularly dangerous is how it intersects with other flashpoints. Taiwan, which produces many of the world's most advanced semiconductors, relies on rare earth materials for its chip manufacturing. Any disruption to rare earth supplies could cascade through the entire global technology sector, potentially affecting everything from military communications to consumer electronics. The defense implications are perhaps most serious of all. Rare earth magnets are crucial components in F-35 fighter jets, Tomahawk cruise missiles, and Predator drones. China's new restrictions specifically target military applications, marking the first time Beijing has explicitly aimed export controls at foreign defense sectors. This isn't just trade policy, it's a direct challenge to American military capabilities. Trump's response reveals both the strengths and limitations of his approach. The aggressive push to develop domestic alternatives shows strategic thinking and long-term planning. The willingness to take government stakes in mining companies demonstrates unprecedented commitment to mineral security. But the reliance on tariff threats and inflammatory rhetoric also risks escalating tensions beyond the point of diplomatic resolution. The market volatility surrounding these announcements offers a glimpse of what's at stake. Friday's sell-off erased gains that had taken weeks to build, reminding investors that geopolitical risks can overwhelm even the strongest economic fundamentals. The fact that rare earth mining stocks surged while everything else collapsed shows how quickly capital flows toward perceived winners in great power competition. Looking ahead, the November 1st deadline for Trump's threatened tariffs creates a ticking clock for diplomatic resolution. Both sides have strong incentives to find a face-saving compromise. China needs American technology and investment, while the U.S. requires Chinese rare earth supplies. But the fundamental tension remains: how do you maintain economic interdependence with a strategic rival? The trilogy investment and similar moves suggest Trump's administration believes the answer lies in building redundant supply chains. Rather than choosing between engagement and confrontation, they're pursuing what might be called competitive cooperation, maintaining trade relationships while reducing strategic vulnerabilities. It's an expensive approach, but potentially the only viable path forward. The broader lesson from this crisis is how quickly economic interdependence can become economic weaponization. What seemed like efficient global supply chains now look like dangerous vulnerabilities. Countries that specialized in particular industries suddenly find themselves holding tremendous leverage over their competitors. The age of purely economic globalization may be ending, replaced by something more fragmented and politically driven. For ordinary Americans, the immediate impact will likely be higher prices for technology products and potential delays in everything from car purchases to home solar installations. But the longer-term implications could be far more positive if Trump's strategy succeeds in creating genuine alternatives to Chinese dominance. The question is whether American consumers and taxpayers are willing to pay the short-term costs for long-term security. The rare earth crisis also highlights how quickly the global balance of power can shift. 20 years ago, China was a relatively minor player in global technology supply chains. Today, it can essentially hold the world economy hostage with export restrictions on materials most people have never heard of. The lesson for other countries is clear. Control over critical resources translates directly into geopolitical influence. As this crisis unfolds, watch for several key indicators. First, whether other countries join the U.S. in developing alternative supply chains or choose to accommodate Chinese demands. Second, how quickly American and allied mining projects can actually scale up production. Third, whether diplomatic channels can find compromises that address both sides' core concerns without triggering a full economic decoupling. The stakes couldn't be higher. In an age where technology drives everything from military superiority to economic competitiveness, control over rare earth minerals represents control over the future itself. Trump's aggressive response may seem provocative, but it reflects a growing recognition that economic security and national security are becoming indistinguishable. Whether his strategy succeeds or fails will likely determine not just the outcome of current trade disputes, but the shape of the global economy for decades to come.